morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Barnett. I'd like to welcome you to today's BI Energy Exchange, where we talk about our research and the latest developments in energy markets. Today, we've got a little bit of a different conversation. A couple of months ago now, I was at our Farm, Food, and Fuel Summit in Kansas City, and I happened to meet our guest today, Elysabeth Alfano. She is the CEO of VegTech, and we had a really fascinating conversation about the intersection of food, agriculture, and energy while we're at this conference. So I thought it'd be great to have her on and have this community who tends to be very energy focused here from Elysabeth. And I've also got Rob Boff joining us, who's normally in New York, but he's in Denver today. He's a senior analyst from the ESG team at Bloomberg Intelligence. So I think it should be a great conversation. So Elysabeth, I want to come to you first and really get a sense of kind of how you think about the investment landscape, because I know one of the things that you do in your space is you run an ETF, EATV, which is a vegan ETF. I think there's a climate angle. So tell us about that, and because I think that'll be a new concept to most of the listeners.
Maybe even for you as well. So I'll take a very quick step back. People always think that because there's a V in there, that it must mean vegan. Then it really doesn't. We're looking at food systems transformation, and our investment perspective is that as we look at the world as we know it on a daily basis almost now, we see so many systems, not just food, energy as well, as you all speak about here. We see so many systems really crashing and needing to be rebuilt. Silver lining here, that's really where wealth is created when you build new systems, job growth and wealth. So there's good to be had there, but there's a little bit of breaking down of the system, and it requires a holistic perspective to have a solution. So we look at food systems transformation up and down the supply chain, and that's how we invest. It's called the VegTech ETF, and as you said, the ticker EATV. So we're really looking at any companies that are innovating with plans for sustainable food systems transformation. And what that's going to do when we say sustainable is it really addresses energy, but it also addresses climate change, deforestation, biodiversity loss. This is the beauty of the food system. It touches on so many things, even public health, reducing public health care costs, pandemic risks, et cetera. So we look to these companies that are forward thinking in this area. And what we found out, and we might get to this later as sector experts, and it's pretty rare to see an ETF run by sector experts. What we found out as sector experts is that when you, let's say, make less beef, you're then making less leather. So kind of acting as a nice hedge, if you will, for lack of a better expression. In the ETF, it's 20% materials. So ultimately, we want sustainable supply chains. So you're looking at 20% materials and 80% food.
You know, one of the things that strikes me, and I don't think this is widely appreciated, because much of the conversation about climate change and emissions really focuses on the energy sector, but agriculture, if I understand correctly, it's something like 40% of emissions. So that these conversations really shouldn't occur in silos. And I'm curious, when you think about the sort of the fund and sort of your background, would you characterize companies that are thinking about these matters? Do they tend to be better run, more profitable, growing faster? You know, what kind of metrics do you look at from a financial perspective when you kind of evaluate the investment criteria for which companies fit the mold?
Sure thing. So much to unpack there. So our methodology is we look for those companies that are innovating for sustainable solutions, primarily in food, but also in materials. And we're going to do that up and down the supply chain. So first, it's a screen in. And I think that in and of itself is, I don't want to say novel in any way, certainly not from a financial perspective, but you're constantly hearing about screens out. We don't touch this and we don't touch that. But you're left with no real change. You're just left with, I'm not tainted from this entity or that entity, but the system's not changing. And I think, again, as we look at our lives on a daily basis, we all see the need for change in many systems. So we're very keen on a screen in for those innovating for change. We also see, again, that's where the real growth is in the innovation. So we look for that. Then we start screening out, okay, well, is it meaningful? Do you have primary products? Or is this a marketing campaign and less than 1% of your sales are really dedicated to food systems transformation as a holistic perspective? And we could talk about that if we have time, about some of the novel technologies coming up and what that really looks like and what your food, you specifically, Rob, what your food system looks like or what the food system globally looks like. Obviously, it's going to be different for you in New York than it is in Nairobi. So these are fascinating conversations to have. But we take this holistic perspective on what will work for the entire planet. And then after we've screened in and screened out to make sure that it's really meaningful innovation, we then make sure there's an IP moat, or there's path to profitability, or there's already profitability, or you're investing in CapEx. So when the market pops, it's not a joke. At some point, we do think the market beyond the Mag 7 will pop. So when small caps come back, and we're not even small cap, we're an all cap blend. So we're just about 60% large cap, which is another fallacy. Along with being vegan, it's another fallacy that we're some nano cap fund. Not true. If you want real change, you're going to have to work with the companies large enough to have distribution, global teams, advertising budgets, et cetera. So in any event, then we look to those companies that are investing in CapEx and they're building the infrastructure now. This is what happens when you build a new system, be it food or anything else. You have to build that infrastructure. Again, that's where wealth is created. We really see the money happening in the infrastructure build. But then, long answer for you, we make sure that they're doing any of those things. So financially solid, and then a final screen just to make sure there's no major problems with management or issues with hiring and these kinds of things.
Yeah, this is interesting. So I want to bring Rob on, who definitely has similar issues for Bloomberg and BI, and I'm curious, Rob, you kind of hear that. How does the ESG criteria that sort of generally exists out there, is it capturing these kinds of things? And I'm also curious to get your perspective on sort of this thematic ETF idea, and are you seeing other companies do this kind of thing around similar themes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first of all, in terms of kind of like how we think about it on the ESG, I mean, I think ESG gets a lot of thought around kind of downside risk, kind of again, as Elizabeth said, avoiding this or trying to stay away from that. And a lot of times it can be pretty successful to help avoid bad performers. But there is also the other side of it, which is the opportunities. Part of ESG is looking for, if you're imagining, there are certain environmental or social factors that are changing with the world, who are the companies that are actually poised to benefit from that? I mean, Tesla is obviously a big case point of that. They kind of were first out of the gate in popularizing EVs, and they've really benefited from that. I hate using Tesla as a positive example, but in this case they are. But absolutely, how I think about it is, thinking about what's the future going to look like in 2030 or 2050, and kind of working backwards. What are the investment opportunities from there? Even, existing companies maybe have new applications. Certainly thematics is one way to look at it. I mean, there's always the EV, but there's other things. AI is one that always gets talked about, and particularly the electrification of, not just on the electrification side, but on the way it can kind of simplify and increase energy efficiency. Even though, today we think of it as a big energy sucker, at some point, it will help with the efficiency side. And and there's other things that it's not just the obvious aspects like EVs. It's, we talk about the energy transition, and you mentioned kind of how you think of oil and gas and ag as separate, but I mean, if you think about it, natural gas is actually a huge input in the ag space. It's it's a main feedstock for fertilizer. So thinking about, all right, if we do kind of stop production of natural gas, what's the impact of that on the ag space? So I'm curious, hearing from Elizabeth, how they think about some of that as well. Kind of what are some of the replacements that are out there?
Two things. Elizabeth, you should answer Rob's question, but I was going to say, Rob, you may not have looked it up, but I believe maybe the holdings have changed, but I believe Tesla is a one of your portfolio companies in the ETFs.
Yep.
I'm curious as to how did it end up in this particular fund?
How the heck did that happen? Yes. First of all, if I could, I just want to go back and go over a stat because it's such an important one. And we're talking about 2030, and you're just simply not going to meet your 2030 goals if you don't address food. So agriculture accounting for 30% of the world's greenhouse gases, the animal portion of that, because there's such awful business equations, they're so inefficient, and all of the methane, they account for 60% of the 30. So 18% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions coming from that sector, obviously ripe for disruption. And then we talked about 2030. So no one's really focused on hitting those 2030 goals. And if you have to address food to hit your goals, you're going to really see this uptick, not just when the market turns, but when food really becomes part of the conversation. We really anticipate that to be around 2025. Okay, so Tesla. Why is Tesla in there? So Tesla is a really great story. And it's kind of funny because I do so many Bloomberg interviews and everyone always asks about Tesla, this kind of fascination with the company. Okay, so Tesla, many may not know that Tesla was the first car company to mandate that all of its leather be replaced with innovative replacements, not animal leather, for environmental reasons. That forced Mercedes-Benz and BMW to go 50% non-leather, so innovative replacements to animal products. And that automobile leather is second only to shoe leather in terms of how much leather is actually produced for the sector. So we like to include Tesla because of that innovative story in pushing materials. So we talked about materials being 20% of the fund. In addition, the technical name of our company or our fund is the Plant-Based Innovation and Climate ETF. So obviously Tesla coming under the 20% climate umbrella, which is really materials.
I do find it a bit fascinating, and folks on this call will probably pick up on pretty quickly the idea that I presume, unless they're doing something very interesting, that if they're using synthetic leather, that is a product of the oil and gas industry, most likely. So it is interesting to see how all of these pieces fit together here.
Yes, so I'd love to address that, and I will get to the overlap of agriculture, fossil fuels, and food. But yes, when you look at the innovation curve of food, and let's face it, we all grew up with meals that we love, and our food system has served us so well for so long. But as we go from 8 billion people to 10 billion people, this comes from the United Nations, that statistic, and my previous statistic about the emissions for ag comes from the United Nations Environmental Program. As we go from 8 billion to 10 billion, but you're not getting more land and you're not getting more water, it just doesn't work to be as wasteful as we are with natural resources. So we're just going to have to find a better business equation, and we can do it. We have the natural resources on the planet. We just misuse them by the current system that we have. So building a better system will benefit us there. Maybe to talk a little bit about the overlap of agriculture and food, I think prior to this conversation, we said, well, what's really the overlap? And they are really the same thing, which is why when we look at the supply chain in EATV, we've got ag tech. A big chunk of the fund is ag tech right in the beginning. So ultimately, you're looking at producing food. Here's the equation we have to solve. You have to feed more people, more nutritiously, using fewer resources in a shorter amount of time while creating less damage. You simply can't do that with what we have now. So ag tech's going to be a big part of that. And I believe the stat that I saw is 17% of the fossil fuel use of the world is used for our food production system. And it makes sense when you think about how we ship food all around the world, as well as you think of the very long supply chain that is in food. If I could just quickly explain this to people, you probably all know this once you hear it, but you just probably haven't thought about it. So we grow crops, and to do that, you have to deforest. Now, we need trees to pull carbon out of the air, but okay, we're deforesting. Now, are we giving that food that has protein and fiber to people? No, we're giving it to animals. They need land, water, time. Okay, they need more food. We're going to have to do more deforesting, more growing crops. Are we giving that food to people? No, we're still giving it to animals. You see this inefficient middleman. Of course, that uses energy. So big energy use in the food system.
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the tremendous amount of corn that makes its way into ethanol. Are you concerned about the food versus fuel debate? Because I get everything you just said about the supply chain, but then there's like that direct use component. Where do you think, where do you land on that kind of debate? And Rob, we can hear you breathing, so maybe mute if when you're not talking, and
I wondered what that
to you
was.
after Elizabeth.
I wondered what that was. You know, so much to talk about. We only have a half an hour, but I think where I was going, please remember everyone, 7 a.m. for me over here, first cup of coffee, is food has served us so well, but it's at the very beginning of a new innovation curve. The old food system that we used is at the very end. So I really don't see these things as binary. It's all or nothing, which is why you use the word vegan. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so extreme. No one in their right mind thinks the world's going vegan. Everyone just take a deep breath. The world's not going vegan. But what we're talking about, and we all lived this through COVID, is building diversified food streams so that we have resilient food streams, which we didn't have during COVID. And the same thing with the Ukraine war. We all saw how quickly India stopped exporting wheat because they were afraid they wouldn't have enough for their own people. We see how quickly these long supply chains, in addition to being inefficient, they're fragile, and we need to build an anti-fragile food system. And that's going to require innovation. And lucky for us, that's where wealth growth happens. So it's good news in the end if we can kind of get there. As it pertains to corn, I just think there's so many innovations in the pipeline that, you know, we're not talking about today, that we're not even seeing, certainly haven't come to market, that these won't need to be an either or. You have food or you have fuel. Obviously, we need both. And we're going to innovate our way out of this box, and we're going to get both. So I don't see it as a concern, so to speak. What I do see as a concern, which is the flip side, and I'm really more of the food person than the energy person. That's where my expertise is going to lie. Although I'd love to talk about some energy stats and food if we have the time. But where I do see an issue is the monocropping that comes from corn, wheat, soy, alfalfa, primarily the wheat and alfalfa and soy. You know, you're not feeding people with this, you're feeding animals. And just to help people understand the scale, let me ask you guys, how many animals do you think are in factories?
Billions.
Take a guess. How many billions? There's 8 billion people on the planet. So how many billions in factories?
It's more than there are people, but I don't know the exact number.
80, I'm going to guess.
Rob, I wish I had like a swag gift for you. I would send you an EV t-shirt. I've been doing this now for years. You're the only person who's actually guessed it. Well done, you. Yeah, okay, so 8 times more animals in factories than there are people on the planet. So that gives you an understanding of the scale of monocropping, which gives you an understanding of the scale of deforestation, which gives you an understanding really of the math. Let's really go there. That's the most important thing. Why would you have to grow so many crops? Why is agriculture the leading cause of deforestation? Well, because you've got all these mouths to feed. Why do you have so many mouths to feed? Well, the calorie conversion to get 1 calorie of cow, 25 to 35 calories of crops. So in addition to it being inefficient, this long supply chain, you're feeding this unneeded middleman. They're bad calorie converters. So, who would invest $2.50 to get a dime back? You wouldn't. So because they need all this food, you have to deforest. Now we're getting into the monocropping. Now we're getting into the emissions problems. So, just to explain the scale of the problem that we have. And so when we say monocropping, how serious it is to talk about monocropping for soy, corn, wheat, and alfalfa.
This raises an interesting question in my mind hearing this discussion. And Rob, I'm curious because Rob and I have gone back and forth many times on this call and just in general about the climate goals for energy companies. If you're an energy company, you pretty much have to have some kind of plan to reduce emissions these days. But I'm curious, Rob, is that outside of energy, is that universal? Like, do the ag companies, from your perspective, actually have a lot of climate plans in place, or do they just kind of that's not in their core part when they think about ESG? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
No, I think definitely not. Maybe kind of less so climate and more environment broadly. Um, you do think about things like water consumption. Um, you know, basically, taking care of the land that you basically need, that is kind of the lifeblood of your industry. But, to Elizabeth's point, resilience is obviously a big part of it as well. Amid climate change, you do need to kind of think about where you're planting food now versus where basically how you need to do business 10 years from now if water becomes more scarce, or if certain regions get significantly warmer. So it's definitely something we think about. You know, the the ag industry, kind of how they're adapting to climate. Other industries as well, think about, particularly they're kind of the flip side of the energy, of the oil and gas supply chain, where, as consumers, they need to think about how to reduce their consumption of oil and gas, how to put in more renewable fuels, things like that. And again, also adaptation as well as mitigation. So, beyond the oil and gas, it's definitely big. And even in some of the tech space, thinking about maybe not so much their own energy use, although obviously electrification is a big trend there, but kind of enablement. How can we build, if for a software company, how can we make software that makes industry, whether it's ag or others, more energy efficient, how they can plan to reduce things like waste, et cetera. And, interestingly enough, I actually, just for our ESG podcast, I chatted with the former CEO of Mars, the big chocolate company, and, certainly, environment and climate are a big deal. He's actually working now with a big industry initiative on focusing on climate goals, because again, it's something that, it's very important to them, obviously, reducing their own mitigation, but also adaptation is a huge aspect. And I think, kind of from that conversation, another question I had for Elizabeth is, obviously we're talking about climate a lot, but in the ag supply chain, there's a lot of social issues as well. I throughout, not just, I keep reminding people ESG is not just climate, but is that something you look at all? Kind of, particularly like in like the chocolate supply chain, there's issues with forced labor and child labor. Is that something you look at as well in your fund, or?
100%. When I talked about that final screen out, just making sure there's no big issues, there would be big issues like that. So we look for food waste programs as well, because there's such environmental, there's so much of the emissions come from food waste and methane, basically methane from the animals. 32% of the world's global methane emissions, again, a stat from the UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, 32% of the world's global methane emissions come from animals and factories. So obviously you're going to need to address a number like 32. And then we also look at food waste programs. So, and then we just make sure, as you say, there's no issues of forced labor or discrimination or sexual harassment, these kind of things. We make sure, but it's funny. We live in a world of big fat labels, and I think they get in the way of solving any problem holistically. And actually, honestly, I don't know how else to solve a problem but holistically. I see people talk about like, oh, can't we do this small innovation where we feed cows something different that they can't digest and makes them sick, but we'll reduce methane? Well, you're not going to decrease deforestation, pandemic risk. According to the United Nations, the top 2 reasons for the next pandemic are the intensification of animal factories. As we get a growing middle class in India, in China, in Africa, those folks are all demanding more meat. You're going to have to innovate for other kinds of meat than the way we produce meat now. So, and I don't know if we have time to talk about innovations, but there's a lot of cool things in the pipeline.
Well, I mean, we only do have a couple more minutes, but maybe sort of one of the big questions that was kind of on my mind when you think about the contribution from agriculture and the contribution from energy, in theory, the world is steering the ship, and say by 2050, maybe it'll be 2060 instead, but we seem to be approaching this net zero world, or we're certainly striving to get towards it. And I think if you talk to the energy world, they kind of have a path. Many people in the energy world have a vision or path of how maybe we get there. In the ag world, how do we get there? Do you actually think that ag can approach net zero, and what kind of innovations are necessary to make that happen?
Oh my gosh, ag is the only sector, as I understand it, and I get this quote from the Institutional Investors on Climate Change group. It's a IIGCC, so I'm probably getting the acronym exactly wrong, but it's IIGCC. I get this quote from them. Agriculture is the only sector that's going to get you to net zero by 2030. And so, you just can't, it's the only sector that can get to net zero by 2030. Not get an entire company.
Or 2050?
No, 2030, but for the sector.
Really?
And the reason is the CapEx spend to fix the food system is so much less than fixing energy and transportation. So, a lot of we're not going to talk about it today, but a lot of the novel innovations, let's say fermenting proteins, that technology already exists. We've been doing that in big pharma for a long time. We ferment beer, AB InBev, as you didn't ask about them, but they're in the fund. Well, because they're fermenting diversified proteins. And so when we look at how food and ag is going to get to their goals, we see diversification of protein streams. We've got a stakeholder engagement going on now. You can check that out at vegtechinvest.com if you want to sign on to that. We've got a white paper out on the best practices for stakeholder engagement. But diversifying these protein, no, the world's not going vegan. It's okay, everyone. Take a breath. It's just you're looking at, balancing out the system so it isn't so heavy as it is now. And diversified protein streams can really get you there. Before we go, I just want to say new LCA is out comparing a Beyond Meat burger. We didn't even get to talk about Beyond Meat because I'd love to answer people's questions about why it tanked, because it didn't tank for the reasons people think it tanked. So some conversation someday, but LCA out on the most current Beyond Meat burger. Again, just starting the innovation curve. They're on burger number 3, so they keep innovating. But using 97% less land, 97% less energy, producing 90% fewer greenhouse gases, and using 37% less energy. So 97 land and water, 90 greenhouse gas emissions, and 37% less energy.
But how does it taste?
See, no, I should have brought Beyond Meat burgers for you. We're coming back, people, because we should do like a breakfast sit-in. Have you had their sausage, Rob?
I have, yeah. Dunkin' Donuts, I think, used to have it. So.
I love that sausage. And please, everyone, there's so much more than just the Beyond Meat burger. Again, you're looking at fermented proteins. You're looking at hybrid products. We can talk about that another day. Cultivating animal fat without the animal, and then infusing that into your black bean burger. So you're getting the better nutritional profile, but you're getting the taste of what you know. And it's just getting people the food they want. And, regen ag will still be there. Factories probably will still be there, but you'll also have novel products in addition to just your straight old, black bean burger. And you'll have a wealth of choices.
I have to ask you another question, because I live in Florida, and I assume you probably saw the headlines from Ron DeSantis banning I think lab-grown meat. So I don't think it affects like the Beyond Meat or the Impossible Burger. But what is that going to hurt innovation?
Oh my gosh, no, it just fuels it. That's ridiculous. So that, this coming from someone I believe who wrote a book on the path to freedom or something, taking away people's freedom of choice, and really the opportunity for business, job growth, and innovation, which is where wealth comes from. So very funny and giving huge headlines to the topic, which is always fun and interesting. There's just no way you're going to be able to feed 10 billion people. So unless you want global war over food and water, because that's what it's going to be, then you're going to have to innovate to feed people. So, I understand that these communities in Florida probably are always going to have the best of regenerated, which is an environmental nightmare, but the best of grass-fed beef, again, environmental nightmare. It's going to suck up a lot of resources, but okay, they're always going to be able to afford that. So their food isn't changing, but that's not going to feed Nairobi, and it's not going to feed Delhi. So, as we look to a global situation where we feed everyone, you're going to have novel innovations, whether Florida likes it or not.
Fascinating. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and we are a couple of minutes over. So, Elysabeth, thank you so much for getting up early to join this conversation. And Rob, thanks also for getting up early to join us from the road in Denver. And for everyone who joined, I want to thank you for your time. Next week, we've got Salih Ilnaz joining us live from the Qatar Economic Forum. So back to oil, energy stuff next week. But I think this was a very interesting segue. And so, Elysabeth, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.